Good evening and welcome to the Journey Home. Every week on this program, I have the great privilege to introduce to you men and women who, for their love of Jesus Christ, follow Him wherever He calls, and some with great surprise brings them back to the Catholic Church. Some never been Catholics are drawn to the church. Others who were Catholics are drawn away, and then by God's grace, they're awakened, sometimes with a very heavy 2x4, and then they recognize the journey back. My guest this evening is one whose journey never left the church, but his message to us is that we must never presume. We must never presume. The old spiritual writers told us that in the ways of God, he who does not progress loses ground. We must never presume on our faith. We must always grow. We must all be converts. We must all choose our Lord Jesus. And my guest is one who is well known to all of you, Bowie Kuhn, commissioner of baseball at one time. I'm thinking right now as we do this program, my father probably knows you more than I do in a sense, because you are of the same generation and he probably followed your career when I was a young man. And he's here to tell us about his journey of faith. And there's one part of his journey that reminds me of a statement that the Apostle Paul once made to Timothy, when he told Timothy, remember who taught you the faith. Remember who taught you the faith. And we will talk a bit about who taught him the faith, and because of their commitment, the seeds that planted in his life. You're an important part of the program, so call us if you would at 1-800-221-9460, or you can send us an email at journeyhome@ewtn.com. Bowie, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Marcus.
What a privilege to sit here with you.
You're very
I
kind.
just heard of you from afar back when I followed the Detroit Tigers and was hearing how you were making sure that the whole baseball environment was a good environment. And of course, that got you in trouble, didn't it?
Well, it got you in a lot of trouble. I was there for 16 years. You know, looking back, it hardly seems possible that 16 years of my life was in the role of commissioner. It was a fascinating time. It was tough. The baseball is, I think, the most demanding of all sports. It's the most contentious of all sports. It grew up as a very contentious sport. And so the commissioner's caught in contention all the time between the owners and other owners, between the owners and players, and so forth and so on. And the fans and the media.
The expectation of the fans.
Yeah. And for me, it was a great opportunity, not only to have a wonderful job. I mean, I love baseball.
Get to sit up front all the time, right?
I could sit up front, yeah. Sometimes I thought maybe it was better if I didn't, but I could sit up front. And I had a wonderful time, but it gave me a great opportunity. It gave me a great platform, because as commissioner, you know, you were one of the best-known people in the United States. Yeah. That's not Bowie Kuhn, that's the commissioner of baseball. That's always one of the best-known people in the United States. And therefore, I had the opportunity to stand for things and try to set some kind of standards that people would respect. And they were my Christian standards. You know, they grew from my love of Jesus Christ. For me, the game had to be a game of rectitude. It had to be a game of integrity. And I never hesitated to say it had to be those things. The first commissioner, Judge Landis, who wasn't a particularly religious man, saw it that way. I saw it that way, not only because Landis had done it that way, and I thought baseball set a great example for the public, but I did it because of my own faith. I said, you've got the platform. You better be an apostle. You better get out there and say something. You can't sit silent. You've got to stand for something. And I did, and I got in a lot of trouble.
Well, you know, we were talking about what our theme might be for the program, and we were joking that very well quoted phrase by Yogi Berra, you know, it ain't over till it's over, right? Which points to the fact that, I mean, baseball has so many images and metaphors, and the idea that when your opponent has a great second inning and now you're down 9-0 and you're heading into the third, well, the game doesn't stop with the third inning. You've still got 6 innings, 7 innings to go, and so in many ways, baseball is very much like life, because it encourages never to give up hope. I think you can have a great 4th inning.
I think that's right, and I think that one of the great presumptions against hope is believing you can't. Maybe that's the greatest sin, believing you can't, despair. So 9-0, no, you're not beaten. Or if you're ahead 9-0, incidentally, you talk to a baseball man, and you know, I used to do this. I say, "Oh God, you're up 9-0. You're making a mess of this wonderful attraction we got on national television. Not that you're going to do anything about it, you understand." And they'll always say, "We want to be ahead 20-0. There's never enough." And so I think it does inspire the thought that you know, you're not beaten until they ring the last bell.
And you get 9-0, kick your feet up. Hey, we got to beat, and before you know it, hey, you can have a great second inning, but so can the other team.
Of course.
Turn around, and do the same thing.
Never give up.
Very much about life. Well, if we would, as we used to do in a journey home, let's have you begin. Talk about your early spiritual journey and what got you started.
Well, I was brought up in the city of Washington, D.C. I'm one of those rare people who is a native of Washington, D.C. I love that city, love it to this day. They didn't have a baseball team anymore for me to love, so I'm a Red Sox fan.
How many times did it change there? I mean, it was the Senators.
Twice. They had two expansion teams come into Washington. Both of them left. One went to Minnesota and became a world champion in short order, and the other one went to Texas. And after that, there were no more Washington Senators. I attended the first Washington Redskin game ever played. I hate to tell you when. It was 1937. I love the Redskins. So my tie, in a sports sense, to Washington is the Redskins, who I'm dedicated to. But I grew up in Washington. I was fortunate to have a trio of ladies around me who were really dedicated Catholic women who loved the Lord very much. They were my two grandmothers. One, an old German lady, who was an immigrant to this country, carrying my father. My father was a native-born German, and she carried in her arms to this country in 1894 actually, beginning of 94. And my maternal grandmother, who was a Marylander going back to the Ark and the Dove, as old as you can get, and Catholic. The Catholics the Ark and Dove is 1634, so now you're in the reign of Charles I, and you have the coming of of Cromwell and the Roundheads and all those problems, and a lot of Catholics, they'd already had plenty of trouble with the Tudors. Now they're having trouble with the Stuarts, and they're getting out of England. So my grandmother is part of that strain of Catholics that came to Maryland, the first religious free state in this country. Free area, wasn't a state yet. And so she was a Catholic, and a proud Catholic. I mean, a really proud Catholic, going back to the beginning of that landing and the beginning of Maryland. So I had these very devout women who loved the Lord, who my mother and the two grandmothers, who they were my guardian angels. You know, I had a guardian angel up here. His name is Tom, incidentally. If you want to meet him, he's right there. But they were helping him. And so I have a wonderful childhood in the church. I loved the church. And you know, I was a good kid. You know, I did all the things that a good kid ought to do. I got all the sacraments of the church. I attended church regularly. I went to confession. I went to communion, and I was a proud Catholic kid, like my grandmother. I was a proud Catholic kid, and so that's how I began.
Strong Catholic environment. We talk about school.
No, not a strong Catholic environment. I always went to public schools. Washington in those days had the best public schools. They were arguably the best public schools in the United States. I had a wonderful education in the public schools. Never went to a Catholic school. I don't know why to this day. I was never sent to a Catholic school except to Sunday school. And there they were puzzled by a kid named Bowie. Where'd you get that name? I had a terrible time with an old nun who thought that was a mighty strange name for a good Catholic.
I ask you where that name came from. It isn't.
I was actually christened George, but Mother tucked in a bunch of Maryland names to make it clear I was a Marylander. You see, Bowie is a Maryland name, and so forth. So I had this wonderful upbringing in Washington, and then time went by, and after I became a scoreboard boy for the Washington Senators, and then I became the chief scoreboard boy for the Washington Senators. World War II. And when I was 17 years old, I went in the Navy. So this ends one phase of my Catholic walk, and it was a good beginning. And now I really had a change, and it was just the change that happens, I guess, to 17-year-old kids, particularly when they get out of their home environment. My home environment was very good. Actually, the environment I grew up in was largely a Protestant environment. My mother had an Episcopal father and a Catholic mother, and the people around us, our relatives, are mostly Episcopalian. So I grew up in a very heavy Protestant environment, which probably was one of the reasons I was sort of a feisty Catholic. I was going to stand for the Lord. And so, but when I got in the Navy, things changed. That for me was, I left behind my three great ladies, and in the Navy, I just began. I didn't stop being a Catholic, not in any normal sense of that, but in my mind, looking back on it, I stopped being a Catholic because I quit going to communion. I quit going to confession. I never missed church. Never missed church. Wherever I was, I'd find a church and I'd go to it as if I were a faithful Catholic, but that was only a symbolic.
So the faith
pride.
side.
It was pride. It was pride.
Okay.
I'm going to go to church because I'm a Catholic, see. But I knew in my heart I wasn't a very good one at that point. I had drifted away. I lived a high life and went to law school, went to college, went to law school. I went to Princeton, which really was not renowned for its Catholicism.
That's right. Presbyterian.
Presbyterian, right.
That's right.
In its founding, and had been presidented by a long line of Presbyterian ministers up until the time, I think, of Woodrow Wilson. I think he was the first president who was not a Presbyterian minister. But Princeton wasn't very Presbyterian by that time, certainly isn't today.
That's right.
The Catholics were not permitted to celebrate Mass in the chapel, where the Protestants could have their services. The Catholics were given Alexander Hall, and there they would say Mass. Well, that sounds like something that wasn't so good, but actually I loved it. We were singled out. We were made something special, and the kind of person that I am just loved that. We weren't just run of the mind. We were set apart, and we had to go to our own place. We couldn't use their place. Today, the Catholics are welcome in the chapel in Princeton, but nobody uses it much.
Yeah, it's a changed school.
It's a changed school, and that's too bad. But so I went through this drift. I wasn't a bad person, but I certainly was a lukewarm Catholic and ready to be spit out for sure. So that was a period of 12 years of my life, and then the wonders of the sacrament of marriage. I married a wonderful Episcopalian named Louisa, the love of my life, and that was 45 years ago this year.
Congratulations.
That's an applause line usually when I give speeches.
That's right. That's right.
And well, she wasn't a Catholic. She was a very Christian person, a very dedicated Christian person, is to this day. Thinks the greatest man in the world is John Paul II, incidentally. Not me, John Paul II. And
well, he is certainly a pope that so many outside the Catholic Church respect.
Absolutely true.
Deeply.
I mean, I with what I do today, I wander around the country and I talk to people. I like to speak at the Right to Life dinners and Right to Life events where you get a great mixture of Christian people, evangelicals, mainline Protestants, Catholics, supporting the pro-life cause. So I find myself with those people all the time, and I love them, and I love their dedication to life, and and they love the Pope. I mean, well, I shouldn't say that as if every last one of them does. I'm sure that's not true, but in general, when I get up and speak publicly, I get up and I talk the message of a Roman Catholic who believes in Jesus Christ, and a Roman Catholic who believes in the importance of the Pope, and in particular the importance of this Pope, who I think is one of the seminal figures of the Church and one of the great prophets of the Church in its history. I think is this man, and I preach that. When I say preach, I mean preach. I preach, and I've gone to gatherings where there are more evangelicals than Catholics, and I begin to hear the amens, and I love it. I just love it.
Well, I think he's probably a mystery to many of them. They see his deep commitment to Christ,
exactly,
his commitment to Scripture,
exactly,
all of that, and so there's this mystery but he's Catholic.
Yeah.
So there's that little mystery.
That's right. And I really think that the problems the Catholic Church has with some of our Protestant brothers are largely ignorance, nothing more.
Right.
And this man is such a devout lover of Jesus Christ. Everything springs from Jesus Christ. And they respect that. Anyway, it was marriage that changed my life, Marcus. So again, it's a woman in my life, my wife. And so I went right back to the church. I went right back to all the things I did the way I used to do it when I was a kid. Back to church, back to the sacraments, all of that. All of that. Making some progress along the road, but still not thinking as I would later on in my life, that what I'm here for is to be a saint. Yes. It had never crossed my mind to think Bowie Kuhn is going to be a saint. I don't think it crossed anybody else's mind. And while I was in baseball, I'm sure there were a lot of people.
Or maybe in Navy too.
Right, you're in the Navy, right. So, I was good, but there was another level that I wanted somehow to get to. I was being led to. If I didn't understand, I had to get there. The Spirit was telling me, little by little, I had to get there. So that was sort of phase 3. 1, my childhood. 2, the Navy. 3, and going to school and law school and all that, practicing law as a young lawyer. And then marriage, children, 4 children, got 9 grandchildren today. That's an apostolate. But 30 years go by, sort of more or less like this. I become commissioner of baseball. It gives me a great platform, as I said before, and I think I used it. By hindsight, I should have used it more, but I think I used it. And people, I think, always, when they try to characterize my time as commissioner, they talk about his standing for integrity. Well, that was part of what I was doing, but that was that phase of my life. And then just about 30 years after I was married, I've left the commissionership. I just left it. I'd gone back to practicing law in New York. I hadn't yet focused on the fact that when Jesus says scribes, read lawyers incidentally, it's almost invariably followed by the word woe. Whoa. But I'd gone back to practicing law.
He uses Viper's Brood at another time.
Viper's Brood, that's right. And I'd been back for a year practicing law in New York when a priest arrived in my office. I didn't know him. I didn't know the name. My secretary said, he's a priest. He wants to see you. I said, are you sure he's a priest? And she said, yes. She's a nice Italian girl. She understood the difference. And I said, show him in. And his name, well known to people on this network, was Father John McCloskey, a priest of the Opus Dei. Yeah. And he had decided, I don't know why, to this day I don't know why, that I needed him. And he is to this day my spiritual director. And it was at that point that my life really took on, my spiritual life took on a new dimension. And I think a better dimension, a higher dimension. In that, for the first time, I really became convinced that, unlikely as it might seem, implausible as it might seem, that Bowie Kuhn ought to be a saint. Somehow or other, figure it out, Bowie. Go out there and try to be a saint. You may fail, but the Lord never knocks you down for the good effort. Go out there and try, and you're supposed to end your life being a saint. So that was the next stage.
Let's, especially thinking about those who are outside the Catholic Church that are watching, what does it, explain more about what it means that we are called to be a saint? And they might think that your goal is to have your name in the Butler's Book of Lives, as if that's what it means to be a saint. Yeah. And connected with that, I think, is this idea of, to him who is given much, much is required. And you were given a platform. God gave you great opportunities. Your name is a household name. You have opportunities. Some use that for themselves, but yet there's a better way to use those gifts. Connected with called to be a saint. Talk about that.
Well, in the first place, I think being called to be a saint is really a comfortable notion for almost any dedicated Christian, because we're called to keep the word. If he keeps the word, I will come and my Father will come. We will live with him. We will eat with him. We will live within him. Mm-hmm. The concept of the Trinity living within us, the Holy Spirit living within us. We usually talk about the Holy Spirit, I guess. That idea began to come into my mind a lot more clearly than it ever had before. That I could be a temple of Jesus Christ. That I could. How could this be? But it could be. And a saint is somebody with whom the Lord can dwell in his soul, and where the Lord can be comfortable there and not be driven out. Not be driven out of that interior castle that St. Teresa talked about. Not be driven out, but it would be clean, a beautiful place where the Lord could live. That notion of of the indwelling Lord is the one that I focus on most often as I think, maybe I can be a saint if I always remember that in my soul is the Lord. And he's not going to stay there unless I behave and keep his word. Then I have a chance.
There's that wonderful term that Jesus uses about abiding in me and I in you.
Yes.
Abiding.
Yes.
Home.
Yes.
It's home.
Yes.
Making this is home.
That's right.
And as you're describing it, that our tendency is to grasp for ourselves, and we're called in your description is to let go, to let God work through us, to come into us. And the more we grasp, and there's always that tendency for the rest of our life. Times we want to grasp, no, we got to trust.
That's right.
And
Marcus, now, if the Lord dwells in your soul, and if you have achieved that St. Francis de Sales calls it the state of complacence, where you finally realize that he loves you. A great many of us, even well-intended Christians, you can't really love me, I'm not worth it. But when you finally grasp the notion that this infinite love is pouring at you, but maybe not being absorbed, and when you finally, through self-giving, open yourself up to that love, and that love then fully enters into you, then you have achieved what St. Francis calls complacence. All the great saints, or many of the great saints, had a description of this. And you have this tremendous explosion of love that now exists within you from God. And that sweeps you along. You're not going to stay on the railroad track all the time. You're like the great chariot of Chesterton. You're going to wobble and shudder here and there, but you're going to hopefully stay on the track if you realize what you have here. So that is that plus the focusing on, by me on Matthew 25. To me, Matthew 25 is just stunning. For most of my life, I really didn't focus on it. I mean, I knew what it said. I really hadn't focused on what it meant in terms of Bowie Kuhn. But when I began to realize that what that was saying to me was that you've got to do something. If this faith is worth a nickel that you've got, then it's got to manifest itself in the love that you give to the people around you. And if you don't do that, that's a sterile faith. You've got to do that. And so wherever you look out there in the world, you see the face of Jesus Christ, particularly in the suffering. This Mother Teresa of Calcutta was a great example of this concept, seeing the face of Christ in everybody. That is what changed. That caused in my life a change from being a guy who went along trying to do the right things and receiving the sacrament of the church and being a pretty good sacramental Catholic, to one who then tried to work his way through the obligations that were imposed on me because a lot had been given to me. I'd not only been the commissioner of baseball, I was a well-known name. I still, in some circles, I don't know how much, they still stop me in airports and talk to me, but I could use that. So now what I do today is I use it, and I use it all over the country. I work for colleges, I work for universities, I go and make, anybody invites me to come speak, I don't charge anything. I shouldn't say this.
The phones are already ringing off the wall.
I say pay my expenses and I'll be there if it's a good Christian cause, or even if it's a good, decent public cause, I'll be there, and I will try to do what I can to be helpful. I'm trying to be a saint, so watch out, here I come.
But that's, in evangelization, that's often the hardest part about evangelization, is getting your foot in the door to get people to hear you. Well, God gives someone an opportunity, and then sadly pride gets in the way, and we get that opportunity and use it for ourselves, use it to make money, use it to try and make a name for ourselves, forgetting to recognize that no, that's a foot in the door given to you by God.
Yes.
It's an opportunity to get His name.
It's an invaluable opportunity. I've been given it, and I'm eternally thankful for it. And I'll tell you something else. I have a wonderful time carrying out this. See, before all time, He gave you a mission, He gave me a mission, He gave everybody out there a mission. And this, I know what His mission is. At least I think I know. And I'm trying to carry out what I think that mission is. As they say, woe unto the guy who on the last day appears before the Lord and he says, how'd you do your mission? And he said, well, I never figured out what it was. Don't ever get in that position.
Yeah, well, that phrase in 1 John where it says that our goal is to be able to stand one day before Him without embarrassment. We will all stand before Him. And I remember when I made my journey from engineering to seminary, and I was making better butter tubs as a plastic engineer, and I was thinking someday I would stand before God. He said, what'd you do with your life? Well, I made this great butter tub. My thinking was, as I looked back, especially from Opus Dei theology, as I've understood, looking back, is if God called you to make butter tubs, you better make the best butter tubs that there was.
Exactly
where God calls you to be, that's where you're called to be a saint. And I was wondering if you give some words of encouragement to those who are watching, who may wonder, well, here I am doing this whatever, and if I was out there, boy, I would really be something. But maybe a word of encouragement to seek being a saint where they are.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, we've talked about me, I guess, because I'm the guy here you've got to interview. So we talk about a guy who was given a big public platform, but that's obviously not true of most people. Most people have to live in the place where they are, but they're still called to the apostolate. They're still called to serve the people around them. Usually, it's their family. Usually, the main apostolate, I think, that most people have is to live a good life and to do what they can to bring the message of Jesus Christ to their family and the people around them. Some have a chance to do more. Some have a chance to work in the local parish church and do things there. To be ministers of the Eucharist and all those things. But whatever. I love the line from St. Thomas More, who on the eve of his execution and martyrdom in the Tower in 1635, did I say 1535, said, there is no empty time. Meaning that all time is valuable, you must use it. God does not expect us to sit around with good health and good minds and not use that as His apostles. And He picked us. John 15:16, He picked us. We didn't pick Him, He picked us, and He wants us to go out and do that. And everybody can do it, and He knows everybody can do it. And the thing that people have to understand is they don't sit around and let Marcus Grodi do it, or even Bowie Kuhn. That would be a weak effort, or Cardinal this or Cardinal that, or Archbishop this or that. You got to go out and do it. And the laity, if you listen to this Pope, if you read Novo Millennio, in Eunte, it's a great call to the laity. He's been calling the laity all through.
That's right. Christus Laity, that wonderful document that John Paul put out, which few laity actually get the chance to read, but it's a great call.
Great call to the laity.
Frontline ministry.
And if you look at this pontificate, the phrase that keeps recurring is self-giving. Of course, it's a great phrase of the church, if you think about it. But it's what I'm saying. It really goes to exactly what I'm saying. Every one of us is given something. You've got to give it. And only through self-giving will you ever achieve any kind of unity with Jesus Christ.
And it's took a long part of your life to discover that, too, hasn't it?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Times when you were there for
and
yourself.
See, I think this is important. I'm involved in various Catholic organizations. First, I'm involved in Legatus, which is the Catholic Chief Executive Officer's organization. Then people say to me, "Well, I'm not certain I want to become a member because I'm not such a good Catholic." I mean, that doesn't make any difference. I mean, can you pass the basic tests? Are you a church-going Catholic? Do you receive the sacraments at least once a year and so forth? Fine, come in, join, and learn that if you're here on the road, you can get to here on the road. So get involved in things that'll help you along this wonderful road, because we all know, and again, you go back to Chested, and he said, this isn't where we belong. Heaven is where we belong. And the joy is knowing this isn't where we belong, but we're on a road to there.
Which is really what it means I'm going to become a saint. Saints are those who spend eternity with God.
That's right.
And that's our goal. We want to spend eternity with God. Right. And how we live this life and the faith of this life determines whether we'll spend eternity with God. And that's our call. And I was just thinking, as you were saying to the folk, to recognize, I mean, here you and I are, but where they are, maybe they think that their life or their job or their calling is insignificant. What can I do for the Lord? But the reality is that you are sitting here all that you've done and all that you are and all the opportunities you have because of the witness of a grandmother and a mother.
That's right.
I mean, those of you out there, the witness to your family, you never know at the time to what extent that seed of encouragement, hope, and faith will have in a young person until years later to see the opportunity.
Exactly right. And here I am today with 9 grandchildren in various great phases of faith. And I pray for their conversion, always for their conversion, because whether you're Catholics or whether you're not Catholic, I pray for their conversion. It reminds me of Alan Key's line. I once spoke on a program with Alan. I was careful to get it arranged so I'd speak before him, not after him. You never want to speak after Alan.
Truth. Oh, he's wonderful.
And I stayed around and listened to his talk. I wouldn't miss it. And great admirer of Alan's. And he gave us a great talk. And then they said, "Would you do some questions and answers?" And he said, "Sure." And so a guy got up and said, "I work in a place where the people are mostly Protestants, and I feel I want to take my faith with them. Can you give me some advice, Ambassador Keyes, on how I can take my faith to my co-workers there?" And Alan gives that wonderful theatrical look as if, "Well, what a foolish question." He didn't say that, but that was sort of the look. And he says, "Don't worry about them." And now you can almost hear the gasp in the room. He seemed to be eschewing the whole notion of evangelization. He said, "Don't worry about them." He said, "Go and convert the Catholics. If you convert the Catholics, the world changes, everything changes. Go and convert the Catholics."
Get them to live their faith.
Yes, exactly.
To not take for granted what we have, the great treasures.
Correct.
We're going to take a break. Thank you, Bowie. We'll be back in a moment with your questions for him. Maybe talking about the symbolisms of baseball. I love it to think and how it teaches us life, and that's why it is in many ways such a great game. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. My guest this evening is Bowie Kuhn. I'm sure a recognizable name to you, though you may not have known his spiritual side. You saw him fighting in the trenches in the baseball issues back. When was the time you were commissioned?
1969, 1984.
All right. 69 to, let's see.
Almost 16 years.
So you came in the year after my team won the pennant in 68.
Detroit. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I loved that year in
Lolich.
68. Lolich, and the Bird.
Vidrich.
Vidrich, that's
And
right.
McLean was not much of a factor.
That's right. He was a disappointment.
Yeah.
That's right. But that's the team I remember. In fact, I don't know if you were thinking about talking about this, but we mentioned earlier that baseball has many symbolisms for life. Did you ever talk about that?
Oh, I think it does. We were talking about it before, that you give up only after the ninth inning is over or whatever, and you've lost. It's official and it's in the books. You never give up. I think that notion is an important one. Baseball, however, has a lot of other symbolisms. See, baseball is the oldest of the organized sports, with the possible exception of lacrosse. As Princetonian, I'd like to mention that because we're after the national championship the last I looked. But lacrosse is older. It was an Indian sport in this country, a Native American sport, and played on the Great Plains. But baseball is the oldest of the organized sports. And it has a great history. And the history was that it started out on the East Coast of the United States. The immigrant people came into the big cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and so forth. Pittsburgh, where my German ancestors came to, and Chicago. And these immigrant people are the ones who adopted baseball and came to love baseball. And love, I think, this sort of aspect of baseball, that it ain't over till it's over. You can do things. You can accomplish things. You can be an immigrant kid who can hardly speak English, and you can play Major League Baseball. There are a lot of them with their foreign-sounding names that played baseball, the Italians, the Irish, and Germans, Heine Manouche, that kind of thing. So I think baseball was an inspiration to generations of immigrant people in the last half of the 19th century and coming into the 20th century. There's another symbolism. And also the phrases of baseball, that have become part of the language. You hit a home run, Bob and Ray used to have that wonderful line about they had a sportscaster, the comics, Bob and Ray, they were one of them. And their sportscaster always ended his sportscast by saying, rounding third, this is Biff, whatever his name was, rounding third and being thrown out at home. But it's full of symbolism for the American people, and I think it's inspired people, and also the notion of integrity. We had the terrible Black Sox scandal in 1919. That's when they got Landis, the first commissioner, and he drove this notion that baseball had to have integrity. It had to stand for something of the American people. It had to show them the right way to live. He was a man of firm rectitude. And that notion still persists in baseball. I promised in 1971 when we moved the Senators to Texas, I said, we're never going to move another club. I was promising for commissioners yet in the future, which I had no business doing probably. They've never moved a club in 30 years.
Is that right? I didn't
never moved a
that.
club. There was rectitude in that. That isn't to say that may not change, but I mean, for 30, I'll settle for keeping the promise for 30 years.
Our first email here is connected a little bit with this idea of sports. Comes from Jack Smokey from Dunellen. Dear Commissioner Kuhn, so much in sports involves the human drama, the acting person, as the Pope would say. It is as if life were compressed into the confines of a playing field. How do you think sports, professional and amateur, can contribute to the development of the virtue and character necessary to being a good Catholic?
Well, that's a good question, and it's one I faced myself in a very real sense. And so I've partly answered it. I think if you live by the rules, sports have rules. And there are also fundamental rules that are above and beyond the rules of sports. That is honesty. Sports, if they're played right, should be honestly performed. And if people are dishonest, they're going to run into some problems, like Landis throwing out the Black Sox players. The game has to be honest. I think it teaches that. I think that is a virtue, and I think that's the virtue is a word rarely used much anymore. But baseball tried to stand for virtues. It's failed in many ways, but essentially that idea of virtue still remains there. You want to see a commissioner of baseball start to fight for something, you try to crack baseball's sense of honesty on the field, and nobody questions it.
And respect for authority.
And respect for authority, although that may be a little more problematic.
I think that's gone through some rough times.
It has gone through some rough times. As a matter of fact, I was doing a radio interview yesterday with a former Red Sox player who has a radio show now. That's what happens. They grow up to become radio shows and call old commissioners. And we were talking about this business of respect. And he was deploring the fact that there wasn't as much respect with the growth of the Players Association. There wasn't as much respect for the management side of things as there once was. And I think he was on to something there. I think if a sport is going to work well, if a business is going to work well, management has to call the shots. Management has to be the boss. This is a free enterprise society. Management has to call shots, and the worker has to give his best and respect management. Very Catholic concept, going back to Rerum Novarum. The worker has to give what the management legitimately expects of him. And when he doesn't do that, he is being inconsistent with his moral obligations. So I think there's a message of that kind.
I was also thinking, we got a caller here, but I was also thinking in terms of the respect of the umpires, the men whose difficult job is out there to do the best they can to call a fair game.
And to take the heat. There's a sort of living martyrdom for the umpires. and you don't be an umpire if you can't handle that, because it is tough. I mean, it really is tough. I love the umpires. When I was commissioner, I would, after almost every game, I'd go down to the umpires' room and talk to them and sympathize with them, because they would call names. They hear it. Yeah. They hear it all.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, from both sides.
But they were the men of rectitude.
Well, again, they're human beings, so they're doing the best they can out there. Not a lot of folk out there in the stands, right?
Yeah.
Looking at one little call.
With different points of view.
That's right. Let's take our first caller, Greg from Connecticut. Hello, what's your call for us? Your question.
Hello. You're discussing how baseball is part of the American way, and motherhood, apple pie, baseball. And motherhood and baseball have hit some bumpy roads, and I was wondering if do you think there are any fundamental reforms to professional baseball or other sports that can help raise the level of our Christian culture and family life?
You know, that's a very good question. I did a show on EWTN some years ago with Dale Hudson, and what we talked about was the impact of sports on the American culture, particularly baseball. And one of the questions Dale raised was, you know, it's so often in sports, people try to get away with things. You know, they try to fool the umpire, they try to fool the official. They pretend in football they've caught a pass, they know it's bounced on the ground. Or the outfielder comes in and makes a diving catch, or was it a catch, and jumps up and holds the ball in the air. Camera later shows it hit the ground. There's not much virtue in that. There's a lot of winning in it, but there's not much virtue in it. And Dale said to me, can that ever change? I mean, this is a questionable negative contribution to the culture, isn't it? And I said, yes, it is. And that's a tough one. And I don't know when that will ever change unless there's a dramatic change in our society that says, look, if guys who do that, we want to have them dealt with in a certain way, because they ought to be discouraged from doing it. And nobody, far from being discouraged from doing that sort of thing, they're encouraged to do it.
I was thinking, you know, I don't want to name any names of sports, but there are, in my mind, what are called pseudo sports, where I guess the wrestling, where you wonder if it's really a sport or not, right? I mean, it's all theatrics.
Cliff diving.
Yeah, you wonder, really, is this a sport or not? Because it's more acting about it. And we talk about integrity, and I hate to see when that tries to make it shift into a football or to a baseball, where you wonder, was this thing all planned beforehand? Did someone really win this game? Or, you know, there's the expectation that these guys are really playing out there, they're giving it their best, they're really trying to win. It isn't just for money, it's for the love of the game. And we hope we don't lose that in our sport.
That's a good point.
Let's take our next email. Anonymous in Ohio. How can you get a person who is so wrapped up in sports, i.e. a TV watching, game attending sportaholic, to realize the transitory nature sports has in relation to eternity, the importance of their soul and of taking time for spiritual matters, etc.? How do you get a sports fan to realize this?
Well, that suggests to me something that may be a little peripheral to the question, but I want to mention it. I think there is a real danger that the sportsaholic begins to get over-focused, creates a wrong God, creates a false God. When sports become so dominant in lives, and this is very common in this country, and you hardly expect an old baseball commissioner to be talking against it, but I'll talk against it, so that you ignore the other things that are important. You ignore God, you ignore Jesus Christ. You ignore your obligations to your family and those near you, the apostolate. Then it's disserving you, and it's disserving society. So you've got to be careful that people involved in following sports don't get overcommitted to it. I remember years ago when the Reverend Jesse Jackson first started the Rainbow Push Coalition. This is when I was first commissioner. He and I made appearances together. This is not the Jesse I see today, but it's the Jesse I saw then. We made appearances together in ghetto high schools to talk to kids about working on their studies, and don't worry about whether you could play baseball or football or basketball. Let that be secondary. Your studies come first. And I love doing that, and I love the way he, in those days, handled that sort of thing. I would like to see him concentrate on more of that today.
Yeah, he shifted a little bit, but it points to the fact that really anything in life can be focused out of proportion. We mentioned mother, baseball, and apple pie. Well, people can focus too much on apple pies to the point where that's their God, eating but the point is, it doesn't mean that the sports themselves are evil. It's our abuse of them or our overlooking at them, seeing as our God, and that can be true of anything in our life. And we're always called to examine where is the center of all that we're doing. And sometimes we struggle with whether this should be sports in high school or in college, and is it going too far? And the competitive, is that good or bad? Well, competitive is wonderful if it is done for the right reasons. If it's gotten out of, for the wrong reasons, it can twist it and make it an evil.
I think that's true, and competition in our society is a very respected and healthy thing, but it's got to be on the right track.
Yeah. Let's we've got a call from Peter in Maine. Hello, Peter. What's your question for us? Hello, Peter.
Yes, hello. Sorry about that. Greetings, gentlemen. Mr. Kuhn, I was wondering if you could comment on something Cardinal O'Connor said late in his life, and that was that he wouldn't be going into any Yankee games, and this as a protest against the decision by the Major League Baseball to play day games on Good Friday. And I'll just hang up and listen to your comments on that. Thank you.
Well, that really is a fascinating question, and you hit me right in my heart, because I loved Cardinal O'Connor. I was very close to him, and he and I worked together on a lot of things. When he said that, I knew where he was coming from. I mean, Good Friday is Good Friday, and you hope the country would shut down and let us do what we ought to do on Good Friday, which is to celebrate that great day in the church calendar and not do other things. I thought the Cardinal was a little hard. We'd been doing that, and we'd been playing baseball on Good Friday for a long time. That doesn't make it right or wrong, but we'd been doing it for a long time. I think the Cardinal had another message there. I've never quite figured out what it was, but I think what he was trying to say, and I shouldn't say trying to say, because the Cardinal was a very articulate man and could say what he wanted to say. But I think the message was, when we get to these holiest of times, let's really put other things aside and focus on Jesus Christ and Good Friday and the risen Christ of Easter and of the Easter season, and not really get over focused on this. Let's be more detached away from the worldly things and toward God. I think that's what he was saying. But several times he was toward the end of his career, as the caller says, and I'm not certain he was even well at that time. Normally I would have picked up the phone and called him and said, "Eminence, I have a question to ask you." And I didn't do it. I thought about doing it too.
There's a scientific principle called entropy, and that is the measure of disorder. Everything moves from order to disorder unless energy is put in to corral that, to keep, and that's true of our spiritual lives. Unless we put energy in, spiritual energy and effort in, it goes to disorder. That's right with our culture. And when I think about the sports, I've got 3 sons, and to try and find time when they're not in baseball and soccer from the time it's in some sense escalated so much in our culture. And a lot of it has to do with its competitiveness. And when I look at what the Cardinal is trying to do at that point, we've got to stop somewhere here, folks, because in reality is now, if our sons are in any sports, they're practicing on Sundays. They have games on Sundays. It's on Saturdays and Sundays. There's never a day,
right,
never an evening, and it just fills every void. Unless we put our foot down and say, we've got to stop somewhere and hold it back. And when you do, you get uncomfortable complaints from those who want it to fill every moment there is.
That's true. I remember when I decided to play Friday night postseason games, the League Championship Series, the World Series, and so forth. I drew all kinds of criticism from those parts of the country, like Texas, where Friday night is a high school football night.
Yeah.
I even had members of Congress calling me up and saying, "You can't put your big events on Friday night because we're playing high school football." And I said, "Yes, we can," and we're going to. But the Cardinal was making a different point.
That's right. That's right. Let's take our next email. Dan Engler from Santa Barbara. Mr. Kuhn, here's a 2-part question. 1, do Protestant chapel groups get many Catholic ball players to become Protestant? And 2, are there enough Catholic team chaplains or groups now helping Catholic ball players practice their faith and keep their faith?
Answer to the first question is, to some extent, I think some Catholics are drawn into the Protestant churches, particularly the evangelical churches, by reason of the chapel. I thought chapel was good. I fostered it. I supported it. An old alcoholic Detroit sports writer started it. He was a wonderful man. He was a recovering alcoholic, I'm very Waddy Spolstra was his name. You remember him, I'm sure. He started it. He was a Protestant.
I'm trying to think of the great radio announcer, Harvey Kell.
George Kell.
George Kell,
right. And he started that chapel in baseball, and I said, just have an occasional Jesuit in there or something. And but I think it had some effect on drawing some Catholics away. But I think well, the second part of the question, are there Catholics who are ministering to athletes? The answer is yes, and I think that's a growing thing, although not so much as a chapel ministry as individual chaplains of football teams and baseball teams. You'll find around the country that's a very common thing. And so you see a lot of Catholic priests who are ministering to sports teams, and it's a good thing.
Your own example is of somebody making the effort in Father John McCloskey, being bold, making an effort to come to you, and that's what we all need to do, is to not be afraid of what someone might think or might be said no to. Well, so he said no to, but make an effort to reach out to those.
Absolutely, and you're meant to be fearless in that, and not shy. I mean, we want a certain restraint as Christians, but there comes a time when you have to speak out boldly. I mean, the reading this that I read this morning is about Paul and the Areopagus against the totally doubting Greeks. And he wasn't shy about telling them about the unknown God. He said, you're worshiping the unknown God, you just don't know you are. Yeah. And he's my God, he's the one I'm telling you about. And
he knew his audience too.
Yes, he knew his audience. That's right. And he says, and that God is going to judge you. At the end, he will judge you, so keep that in mind. Some of them didn't like it, some of them laughed, and some of them said, come back and tell us more.
Let's see if we grab one more email. Mary from Tampa. Dear Marcus and Mr. Kuhn, thank you so much for your show. You're much watched and appreciated. Thank you, Mary. My question is this: how much ambition is appropriate for a young, committed Christian who has a desire to play professional baseball? How much is too much? How does one assess the talent he thinks he has? How will it affect his walk with Christ?
As to assessing talent, the system will assess the talent. Believe me, good players are not overlooked in any sport. The scouts are out there, they're watched, and they will assess the talent. If you don't hear from them, you can draw an inference that you don't have the talent to go much farther. The commitment is like the commitment that a watchmaker has to making watchmaking. If he makes watches perfectly to the exclusion, it's a John Paul II reference, incidentally, the watchmaker.
Right.
If he does it to the exclusion of his faith, to the exclusion of Jesus Christ, then that's a problem. That's what we talked about a while ago. There's got to be some detachment from the world in your life, or you will never get there. You will never be a saint. That detachment is the key thing. You're called upon to do your job well. If you have a professional career, you're called upon to do it well. The Opus Dei concept, do your work to the very best of your ability. Worship God through your work. Do it well. Make it a prayer. This is the way you make your professional life, whether it's in sports or someplace else, a true inspiration and a fulfillment of the instruction we receive in Scripture to pray constantly. How can you pray constantly? By living your life as if it were a prayer.
How about in conclusion, talk about how your journey of faith, as always a Catholic, but as a growing and sometimes struggling Catholic, how this whole thing has brought you closer to Jesus?
Well, it certainly has. I will give you an example. When I was younger, I would never go to somebody and say, "I believe in Jesus Christ." I couldn't do it. I did. I did believe in Jesus Christ, but it wasn't my way to go out and say that. Some years ago, when I really began to get into heavy-duty public speaking, because I'd let it be known that I'd be available. They invited me to come to Steubenville and speak at one of the Steubenville conferences. It's the first talk I ever gave to a conference. I've given many since, a men's conference, and I loved it. And I tried to figure out how I would open it, how I would convince these people that an old baseball commissioner and lawyer at that, had anything worth saying. And my opening line was, I tried to say to myself, why am I here? How can I tell you why I'm here? And it came to me in the middle of the night, I'm going to tell you why I'm here. I'm here because I'm madly in love with Jesus Christ. the whole place stood up. The whole place stood up. That's an example, Marcus, but for me, that is where I've been taken.
We thank you very much for joining. It's a great pleasure. Thank you for your witness and all that you do. God bless you in that.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us in the journey home. It's always a pleasure to introduce guests to you that you've heard all the time but maybe didn't know the extent of their faith and love for Christ. So thank you. I'll see you again next week.